Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr. In this episode, Martha Tatarnic welcomes Christopher Dawes, a Toronto-based performer, conductor, and consultant. A 3-decade fixture of the Toronto music community and frequent collaborator with many of its top institutions, Christopher currently serves as Organist and Director of Music to Rosedale Presbyterian Church, and Artistic Director of the 18-voice Marion Singers of Greater Toronto. For 2 decades, he has served as Collaborative Pianist and Coach to the graduate and undergraduate instrumental and choral conducting programs of the Faculty of Music, University of Toronto, and as a director of Canada's Summer Institute of Church Music. Since 2018, he has also chaired the executive of the Southern Ontario chapter of the Hymn Society of the U.S. and Canada. Chris's graduate work in the area of music criticism and musical genre has led to occasional blogging and podcasting under the banner Ideas About Music, speaking at conferences, and eventually founding the Celtic-crossover band Chroí in 2013. Let's welcome Christopher to the show.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I am your host for the summer season, Martha Tatarnic, and today I am having a conversation with Christopher Dawes, a longtime friend. We've worked with one another in a variety of circles over the years, and Chris is also one of the preeminent musical leaders in the mainline church in Canada today. Welcome to the podcast, Chris. It is such a pleasure to get to talk to you today.
Thank you, Martha. I am delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to our talk.
Thanks. Okay, so you're familiar with how our podcast is structured. We're going to spend a little bit of time at the outset just kind of painting the picture for people, allowing them to get to know you a little bit. Maybe you can start by talking for a moment about your relationship with the church or with Christianity growing up.
Yeah, so my grandfather is a figure that I derive a lot of inspiration from. His name was Charles Haddon Spurgeon Dawes, and he was a minister and a musician. He sort of was one of those small town ministers that incorporated music into his ministry a great deal. However, my family didn't attend church when I was a child. We were connected to my grandparents quite closely, but they lived a long way from us, and church was not a part of our life. So, like a lot of teenage musicians, my piano teacher encouraged me to accept a church playing position, which I did.
Okay.
And eventually, when I asked her about my interest in learning better to play the organ in my teenage years, she encouraged me to go to a professional teacher because she was mainly a pianist. So I ended up at an Anglican cathedral, and the rest, as they say, is history. I kind of followed that tradition for quite a long time. And before very long, you get a lot of support when you're a young musician, especially around a church. I felt a lot of support, and I began feeling the need to say thank you. And where was that thanks going to go? Well, clearly it was going to go to God. And this was kind of a reconnection with that family tradition that sort of hadn't been sustained in the form of a regular church attendance. So anyway, I had a very wise person point out to me that my name was Christopher, which connected with this old story of a saint who bore Christ unknowingly across a river. And so when I learned that from this then Bishop of the Diocese of Ontario, I kind of took it to heart, and that was how my journey really started.
Wow, that's amazing. So music was definitely kind of the evangelical impulse or invitation into the Christian faith for you, it sounds like, along with those family roots.
Yeah, it was kind of like it was planted there before I had an opportunity to be a Christian, or in a way, because music certainly was what got me in there, and it was just waiting for, I guess, God's time to activate.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Beautifully said. So how would you say that that being a Christian has changed for you from that that first sense of wanting to offer thanks back to God to now, many decades into the work of serving the church?
Yes, well, so it did start with that reflex for Thanksgiving, but when I left university, I had become an organ performance major, and I packed up a number of musical skills with me and went to the big city to sort of make my way. And as you know, in the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church has this structure of dioceses which have bishops, and those bishops hold kind of a ceremonial seat in a building called a cathedral. And that word cathedral suggests a lot of traditions for liturgy, for theology, for music, and so on. But at its heart, it is a church of churches. And before too long, when I moved to Toronto, I found myself at St. James Cathedral in Toronto, and synod meetings and a variety of other events through the year really entered our life as a church, but as a church to churches. And so there was this much larger community that focused in at least a few times a year
Right.
on our cathedral. So I had an amazing opportunity over the 12 years I served St. James Cathedral to sort of explore this diversity. And when I got married and our kids were little, I left St. James, but I stayed kind of fascinated by that idea. So ever since, I've been kind of a nomad, traveling through and around the church scene through its music. And about the time I left St. James, I also took on a volunteer ministry that we're going to talk about a bit later as director of the Summer Institute of Church Music. So Christianity began in simple thanksgiving, but it then turned into this idea that I could be a minister in many churches, many traditions, and there were lots of other wonderful people out there doing the same thing.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to say that I think it really has been that nomadic existence that you have taken on that has been a big factor in why you have been such an influential voice in the life of the mainline church, particularly in terms of musical leadership in our church. So it's definitely, I would see it very much as a sense of call on you in particular. That's been pretty integral to how you have served.
I would agree with that. I think if I had stayed in one place at St. James Cathedral for longer than I did, not only would my children's childhood have been quite different than it was, but uh, I might not have become certainly not as knowledgeable about the modern church, and as you say, maybe not as influential.
Yeah, your offering would have been quite different. Quite different. So can you just tell us what your current ministry context is and anything interesting about how you got there?
hmm Well, I kind of look on my current ministry context as sort of a height that I've only gradually risen to. Some people would look at St. James Cathedral and say, well, where do you go from there?
Hmm.
But one of the first places I went was when I got married. I joined my wife's denomination, which is the Christian Reformed Church in America, and by national denomination in both the U.S. and Canada. And it's quite ethnically Dutch to a degree. And I sort of married into this fairly traditional family. And at the time that I chose to leave St. James Cathedral, I simply stayed and was a volunteer musician in my congregation for a few years. before I began pursuing a professional church music ministry again. And the CRC opened to me the doors of Reformed theology and also a deeply word-driven pursuit of the faith. And that was something that hadn't been so much a part of my faith or my ministry to that point. So again, I followed this nomad path, and now I find myself among Presbyterians. I serve a small congregation just on the edge of downtown Toronto. That's quite handy to my work at the university and other areas of the Toronto music scene. And I do find in this particular unusual church a wonderful union of that great love of music and its diverse place to operate within the life of the community and the life of the liturgy, but also a very strong tradition of preaching and a very strong interest in doctrine and belief as well. So I kind of feel like I've landed at some place that makes the rest of my journey make sense.
Yeah, brings together a lot of different threads.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Is there a spiritual practice that you're finding particularly meaningful right now?
Yes. Well, this might surprise you and our listeners that a lot of we professional musicians don't listen to very much music. So
That does surprise me, actually.
yeah, well, so obviously music is a passion and an enormous interest. But because we tend to be planning music and practicing music and making music a lot, having a parallel listening stream very often doesn't fit into the day very well.
Right.
And you know, I'm a big podcast fan, with no doubt you are too. And so a lot of my listening kind of follows that strength. So my enforced music listening, I got involved with, as many people do, with the scriptural practice of Lectio Divina many years ago. And I kind of have evolved it as I've gotten a little bit more time into my life into a musical form that is listening to music for its scriptural content. And in many cases, music, as you know, sacred music very often has a scriptural text of some kind, and very often the composer and the interpreters draw directly on that scriptural text for what we finally hear as listeners. In other cases, the way the music's written doesn't seem to directly comment on the scriptural content. I mean, you can think about the joyous choruses of Messiah around Jesus' birth, or the more severe and violent ones around his suffering, in which the composer has kind of made the music sound sort of like what Scripture is saying. There are other cases where that isn't the case, where music is sort of more of an abstract sort of conduit for the beauty of Scripture just to stand on its own. And then there are times where a song doesn't even really make sense until you're standing in a room and singing it with a community faith. So I call this an enforced musical listening is sort of the spiritual practices I've come to know. So it's music for Scripture's sake. And what does the process of listening to Scripture through music do for us? And I found it very enriching.
Yeah, you know, I love this question that we always ask all of our guests because we get so many different answers and there's some overlap in the answers, but this is one I haven't heard before, one of our guests' names. So I can imagine how it could be a spiritual practice that many of our listeners, whether they're musicians or not, could find like really meaningful. So thank you for that, Chris.
And if you know Lectio Divina, of course, it is a practice that involves a fair amount of repetition, which by its very nature, a lot of sacred music does as well. You can very often have a single verse of Scripture which is repeated quite a few times in a musical setting. So it's kind of a little bit of that ancestry of Lectio Divina built into this evolved practice.
Yeah, I can very much see that connection between Lectio and this listening practice. I think that makes a ton of sense. That ability for a piece of Scripture to just get kind of deeper and deeper into your being. To to make that journey. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Let's get on to our main topic today, because I reached out to you really just considering all of the different sorts of leaders and authors that we have on the Future Christian podcast. But as I was thinking about that and thinking about some of the conversations I had been having with you, I was aware of a gap in Future Christian. I think in so many of our congregations, the most emotional connection about what we're doing and the worship that we're offering comes through the music. Certainly in the churches I have served anyway, a lot of the strongest opinions get voiced around the music, and a lot of pressure gets placed on the musical program of any given church as we consider our church's viability, as we consider what is going to connect and what is going to help the church connect with new people, especially. But at the same time that is so central to the life of many of our churches, we really haven't featured any conversations that I'm aware of anyway on this podcast with church leaders who are leading our music. So, Chris, I'm really grateful to get to talk to you today about some insights and experiences that we need to hear from our church's musical leaders.
It is my honor to be in the seat.
Thank you. So maybe you can start by sharing from some of your experience on the ground as a nomadic church leader. Are there some common denominators that you see in the faith experience or that sense of vocation, that sense of calling from people who are leading our church's music? I'm guessing that not many people get into musical leadership in our churches for the fame and fortune, for example.
No, you would be right about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's well, okay. So just a couple of disclaimers. Church musicians are as diverse as the church itself.
Fair enough. Yes.
And we are no monolith. And I can't presume to speak for the experience of all of them, perhaps not even most of them. But I have been blessed to meet and work with a pretty wide range of musicians across denominations, ability levels from different countries, and so forth. And I want to be mindful. I sense perhaps musicians have not occupied a lot of space so far on Future Christian, but I'm also guessing that its constituency skews a little bit towards the end of pastors and ministers, general members of the clergy. I'm sure it's not exclusively that at all, not even from my limited listening to the podcast so far. But I just want to be mindful as I try to talk about some of the unique challenges musicians face, both that some of those challenges are faced by other leaders in the church who are not musicians. And of course, the experience in those places are different. So it's very kind of specialized. So on the ground, church musicians are special agents of beauty and power. It's a way I like to think. So the church looks to musicians to help raise levels of celebration, of poignancy, of scripture, of the faith, and so forth, of gravitas, of emotion. And it is within a framework that is very heavily driven by the spoken word. And that is just by the nature of the kind of beings we are. So music is this interesting sort of special agent contribution. Send James Bond or someone in to do something that you can't do with the structures that are all there. Musicians really love being able to share that gift with our congregations. But like anyone sharing gifts, we need to feel valued. We need to be able to apply knowledge and experience that we have, and some degree we need to be resourced in order to to help our services reach their full potential. So we have some sense that we're doing something important, and yet we have a great sense, I think, of the limitations that we face around it. I think in this way we're very similar to ministers of the word and sacrament. You have the same situation of the value and importance of what we're seeking to accomplish, but we're acutely aware of the challenges that we face as well.
Yeah, okay. Interesting. Yeah, I wrote down some of the words that you said there, especially around agents of beauty and power. And, it really does provide such an access point for meaning that can't be articulated with words, even if it is word driven. It's that extra dimension of meaning that you can't access by word alone.
That's right. And I think it's worth saying as well that it might sound, if I talk about special agency and beauty and power, that it's this thing sort of just being interpolated into worship that is its own thing. But it only exists because of the relationship it has with the members of the congregation, or with the relationship that it can form with the congregation. So, in other words, the beauty and power I'm referring to, in some cases, it's power of a verse of scripture, for God so loved the world, that is so nascent, that's so present in people's thoughts, that it simply flourishes, and the music simply helps it to take that extra importance. It could be in the power of a very familiar hymn, one that one learned as a child, that the power is different that it exerts. It's just that we tend to understand that there is a power, and that the notion of beauty, or the notion of whatever else it introduces, of course, because some church music is intentionally unsettling or upsetting, even depending on the topic that it's intended to address.
Yeah, can we just dig a little bit more into the vocation piece? Because I really take your point that that we can't speak for everyone, and for every broad brush stroke that we try to paint, there's going to be a million exceptions and so on. But I have a lot of friends in musical circles, and I have a lot of friends who have served in musical leadership in the church. I do think that there is a common story like yours where people might get into it because it is a paying job as and a musical opportunity. It's a one way to make some money as a musician. But my overall sense would be that the people who stick with it and really invest in a real sort of multi-year kind of way, that there is very much a sense of calling about it. There is a sense of being led by faith and a desire to serve. Like, do you think that that's fair?
I think that is fair. I think for some, it is a musical opportunity, and it's an income opportunity for some musicians. And to be frank, I think some that engage in church music do see it as make a job that they might do at the early end of their career, and then wish to leave it behind, either for the purpose of being a freelance Christian who simply pursues the faith along with the others in pews, because I know several instances of people who have chosen that will be their musical route rather than to lead anymore. Or someone who perhaps never even pursued the faith, but nonetheless felt they were able to share something that the church needed and benefited from.
Yeah.
But I think you're equally right that the people who invest in it over a multi-year The fame and fortune pieces are not really there. It is definitely a labor of love, and it is a personal vocation and calling. And so I think you're absolutely right about that. But I would add to this conversation that because of being a paid person within the church, whatever one's motivation uh, to be there is very often a very different manner of treatment. There's sort of a little bit of a lens that is applied to people who are paid by the churches. And this applies to ministers as well.
Yeah.
That there are different expectations where our Venn diagram includes employment over here and membership over here. And those intersect for most of us.
Right.
But because of that, if you might call it tension. I heard you and Lauren talking about this on a recent episode. Because there is a tension between these two status pieces that we hold. You will have some people that wish to treat you more like an employee than a member. Some people that wish you to behave more like a member than an employee. And very often this can give rise to tension.
So let's follow that tension conversation a little further. And maybe you can just articulate for us, what do you think are the biggest pressure points on our musical leaders in our churches? What are the biggest stresses that they carry?
Well, here again, I think we intersect a lot with our colleagues, the ministers of word and sacraments, that there is very much a shared pressure point around um, around limitations of resources, those being human, those being financial. There is at least, I think, somewhere in most churches today a modicum of existential doubt about the broader institutional journey. And sometimes that can be very real when church experiences serious financial problems. So in these ways, couple that with one's own stresses of life and balancing limited time for ministry with other responsibilities in life and those types of things. I think musicians feel very much in this place as well. Musicians do tend, of course, to be more part-time employees. Therefore, the amount of time they have to offer and the amount of income expectation they can have is lower. And yet, interestingly, as a leader, you share a space on Sundays with the minister that is somewhat co-equal. I don't mean that, but you're responsible to the length of the service. You are as visible as one another. So generally speaking, it's kind of like being a minister in a smaller and more limited church, I guess you could say. So I think I think there is that. I think there is the piece of expectation for what we can achieve that is limited by factors beyond our control. And so there are the resource pieces. So you have, let's say, a very small choir, or you have an organ that no one can afford to repair, or you have a band that doesn't really have enough members to properly lead the music of the service in a way that we all wish that it could. Those pieces are sometimes relatively beyond the control of a musician, and yet the musician will tend to be in a situation of having more control exerted. So you have, in some cases, you will have committees or colleagues that exert a direct control over what music a church can sing. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it probably ideally would better exist in a conversation of some kind between a committee and a musician, or whatever structures like that. Musicians walk into the church situation with a certain amount of experience and a certain amount of knowledge that they wish to share. And unfortunately, sometimes they can't use that experience and knowledge to full benefit of the congregation. So I guess that would be it. It's similar pressure points to those of our clergy colleagues, but within a smaller scope in most ways that you could measure the scope, and also arguably without as much overarching control over the sphere and influence.
Yeah, I mean, those are a few fairly major pressure points. I'm really struck as you're talking by, how often we talk on this podcast about bivocational ministry and what that looks like for clergy as things shift and change in our churches. And yet, as you say, like almost every single musical leader in our churches is bivocational. I mean, the number of full-time church leadership musical positions available in the mainline church in Canada, for example, like, could I maybe name on one hand?
I would think so. Yeah, it would be close to that. A few churches in our major cities, and outside of the main line, it can be a little different because the whole economies of scale outside of the mainline denominations are a bit different. But no, you're quite right about that. The other piece, I just wanted to borrow a word that I also heard you and Lauren speaking about recently, which is individuation.
Okay.
And this is the isolation that the vast number of ministers of the words and sacraments, as well as ministers of music, operate in. You're not entirely separate from the community, but you are unique. And
right.
So you are unique in the level of responsibility you carry. You're usually unique in the knowledge and experience that you carry to bring to bear on the situation.
Yeah.
And yet, in many cases, you're individuated enough that you're kind of alone in experiencing that within your community. And I would personally say that there is a huge opportunity for better relationships between a musician and their minister, and vice versa, because of this very effect, that singular nature. But churches are more likely to employ perhaps a main minister and then a more part-time minister than they are to have a main musician and part-time musician. But I've always felt that interactive nature of the relationship between the minister and the musician probably offers us both a lot of pastoral potential because of this effect of loneliness, of isolation from just the nature of our positions.
Yeah, I think that you're dead on with that. I really do. And, if this conversation can spark a little bit more attention to those relationships, I think all for the better. I want to share with our listeners some words that you shared with me recently, because I think that this says an awful lot about the place, the power, the position of music in the life of the church right now. So let me just read some of your words back to you, Chris. Church music can be accorded with too much power to save a broken church, sometimes entrusted with an impossible task to be the single tweak that allows all other problems to continue unaddressed. Now, that is a sentence that really packs a punch. I think that, what you're saying there rings really true with my experience, which is that we sometimes fool ourselves into thinking that if we just get the music right, then decline in our mainline churches will be solved, and that must be the problem and the solution. At the same time as we, accord it too much power to save the broken church, as you say. I think that we can also, at the same time, as you've already outlined, really undervalue and under-resource the vocations and the offerings of those who are leading music in our churches. So can you just speak to that overvaluing and undervaluing dynamic? Because I think it's a big thing in terms of where music sits in our churches.
Yeah, there is a lot in there. And as I've now come sort of to a point of, it will be nearly, I guess I could describe my church musical career as closing in on 40 years in length. And I would say this has been a conversation from the very beginning. And so positively, I would say that conversation is a bit more mature now. I think we've seen enough churches try to fix their systemic problems of various kinds using music and have that go terribly wrong.
Right.
We've seen lots of examples of that.
It's not the magic bullet that we're all looking for.
That's correct. So I do feel that this conversation is more mature because we're kind of divided into denominations. I think some parts of the church are more mature in this discussion now than others. But certainly over my time, considering that I came in as a classical musician at a time where non-classical music, particularly in the praise and worship form, had become already deeply influential at that time. If you look across the broad sweep of the church, for sure. And over my career, I think it and other influences have kind of assaulted the idea of older traditional music on a pretty consistent basis. So that this has been a conversation for a long time. But it is curious or ironic, as you note, that while we accord music with all of this power, we do also somehow manage to undervalue the contribution of those that make it, to the point that they very frequently do not become influential voices in the path of a congregation. Their concerns and thoughts about how music ought to continue to evolve can very often get lost in discussions or be excluded rather intentionally from those discussions. I mean, music has played an important role in revolutions and in politics and in history in general. The whole reason that we have music, some scholars argue, is because there were times we came to a place where the ideas we were exchanging, the words that we like to use to exchange, to talk about important things, just haven't sufficed.
Right.
And so you get, all we are saying is give peace a chance, or we get, God keep our land glorious and free. You get these little pieces that can only really be expressed fully in music. And so it's not hard to understand why the power we attach to it. But it feels for musicians very much more often like scapegoating. Because churches, a lot of churches I am aware of that may have fairly prosperous music programs are not terribly welcoming places. Sometimes they can be very exclusionary in their sort of general tone, and sometimes by direct policy, which can be a troubling thing. Churches tend to get segregated a lot ethnically as well, not perhaps so much here as they do in the U.S., but they are. It's definitely a factor that I think is a fairly serious obstacle for the church. I think also there is this whole question of music's relationship to adults and youth, where musical genre tends to be very tied up in that conversation, when it's actually a much more interesting conversation to say that all the old folks like this and hate that, and all of the young folks like this and hate that.
Yeah, just ask my teenage daughter what she thinks of those kind of blanket differentiations and you'll get an earful.
They're quite, it's quite insulting. And yet we're allowed to hold these conversations in churches mainly because we're, dominated by one of those two age groups. That's just kind of how it goes.
So, thank you for outlining some of those challenges, some of those dynamics, some of those pressures, some of those contradictions. You teased this at the beginning of our conversation, but you have another role in which you serve on the board of directors of the Summer Institute of Church Music. And I think it's fair to say that the SICM really exists to give support and to create community for musical leaders across our churches. We're going to be hanging out together this summer, the two of us, at SICM, because I'm going to be leading some daily keynote addresses on the topic, Why Church Music Matters. Can you just give some information to our listeners, our audience, about SICM, who comes, what you're seeking to offer, how the genesis of this unfolded?
Absolutely. Well, and we're very excited that you're going to be part of our session this year. The Institute,
I'm excited too.
Yeah, the Institute was founded in 1970, very different time and place for the church. And it has, as you've said, provided community. It has provided instruction and training. We like to think it provides some inspiration. Basically, it has, for most of its history, taken the form of a week-long meeting in person at a beautiful old castle in Whitby, Ontario. It's called
a castle.
Yes, that's always been a cool part of it. It has a fascinating history. We don't have time to get into that place. It's now an independent school. And in recent years, in fact, the Institute, particularly under the influence of the COVID pandemic, sort of moved first online and then into a smaller venue. But it has been this place that people could come to commune together, to worship daily, to discuss topics of importance to church musicians, to learn a little bit from noted teachers and work on their skills and other aspects, and also to network, to meet one another, because, as I've said, church musicians on the whole work very much alone and don't have that kind of community in many cases provided locally to them. My own involvement with the Institute began in the early 2000s, about that time that I left St. James Cathedral, and it has been now 20 years that I've served on the board. So the Institute suffered a fairly significant setback with the COVID-19 pandemic. We had 50 years. Our 50th session was in 2019. And then we slammed directly into the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, moved a much reduced gathering completely online that year, experimented with a larger completely online gathering the following year, and then sort of moved into a hybrid space in the year after that. So we were kind of making our way back to what we hoped would be a big relaunch in 2023. But unfortunately, we hit sort of a perfect storm of a lot of related events taking place in the Toronto area at the time. We certainly had not recovered our strength from the COVID interruption, and we were forced to cancel our 2023 session because of lack of registrations. So we were at this kind of dark night of the heart place as a board, and about that time, I discovered Why Gather by Martha Tatarnic. And this was at the point we reached out to you a little over a year ago. And we sensed that a lot of what you were covering in terms of your personal experience of the church and also its institutional life applied to our institution. I mean, we're very much, we serve, if you will, at the pleasure of the church community. We've been supporting its musicians for over 50 years from all denominations, and they come from all over Canada, as well as from the US and other countries sometimes. But we had come to this place where we were wondering whether it was worth it anymore. We have more and more churches that are in dire straits, that are cutting music programs and positions. We are a big country and it's expensive to travel to an in-person location. And so we had all of these issues swarming around us. And the glimpse of your book kind of helped us put that into a conversational place that we thought would be very valuable for us as an institute, as well as for our students and the churches we serve.
So what are people's options for registering for this summer? How can they get connected with SICM for this summer, either for people listening or for people listening who would know somebody who would really benefit from getting connected in with this community?
Right. Okay. This is great for me to have the opportunity to share this information, and I'm sure I'll have a chance to say this later, but our website at sicm.ca also contains all of this information. So our gathering will take place from July 9th to 11th, and it will be held in person in Whitby, Ontario. We're using a 3-day, 4-hour schedule. So from 12 p.m. until 4 p.m. Eastern Time, in person at a church, an Anglican church, All Saints Church in Whitby, we will be holding our sessions in person. We will be singing together. We will be hearing addresses and having discussions led by faculty, including yourself. And the 12 to 4 p.m. timing, if that sounds a little strange, it was very specifically designed so that people across Canada could join at a convenient point during the day. So our friends in the Pacific time zone, right across North America, because of course this is of interest to people in the US as well, can join beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Right.
And the time zones work all the way across the country until we have our friends in Halifax in the Maritime Atlantic time zone join from 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and our Newfoundland friends at 1:30. So the idea is that this all falls roughly within the workday space in this beautiful summer time when some of us have a little bit more time on our hands, July 9th to 11th. And of course, those who can't be in person with us from 12 to 4 at Whitby are joining at these other times online. You can have a little group that joins from your church or your living room. You can join individually, as you probably have joined far too many things in the last few years, but those options are all available. And as a result of this schedule, we've also been able to lower our registration fees and retain faculty. And we're very excited about this new format. And we hope many listeners from Future Christian may be interested in checking us out.
Yeah, thank you. I think that attention by you and the board to removing as many barriers as possible so that people can access that community, that support, that learning, I think that's incredibly important. So before we close with our rapid fire questions, I just have one more little question. I mean, I don't expect you to be able to give a completely comprehensive answer to this, but what do you think that music offers the faith of the future? What do you think that the role of music is in our churches, particularly in a time of declining religious participation, rising secularism? What do you see as the healthy and vital role of music for church?
Well, this, in a nutshell, I would love to see both our church's musicians and our church's leaders, as well, really, as all of its members, seeing music as this gift, as something that the special agent can be sent in to actually really enrich our life as a community. And I'm going to say also that it's not necessarily simply limited to the focus of the Sunday worship service, because that is obviously a huge musical focus for most musical programs in churches. But music creates community around choirs and other ensembles. It can be incorporated into meetings in ways that it often isn't. Meetings can be very dry, and yet it's very easy to begin and end a music with a hymn. I do return to James Bond. I think I spent too many years around you Anglicans is my problem, why I have such a British image. But I think about him saying, this is the job for Bond. We're going to send our musician in to make this celebration really special. And music is going to be able to do that for us. And Q is always there providing all of those gadgets, all of the little tools that the special agent needs in order to really make the mission a success. And the musician finally is coming in as this figure who commands appropriate respect and yet is fully committed to the mission as everyone else. So that's kind of the paradigm I would like to bring. I do think music is viewed sometimes as a bit of an ongoing responsibility or something that doing a job for us like our dishwasher. I think what it should actually be doing is really changing and really enriching the life that we lead together.
Well, that's a very memorable takeaway. We need music to be allowed to be James Bond in our congregations. We all need some more James Bond. Thank you for that, Chris. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back to our rapid fire closing questions. Welcome back to our Future Christian podcast. I continue to be here with Chris Dawes. And Chris, we're going to go through our closing questions that we ask all of our guests. We always tell our guests that you can take these questions as seriously as you want or as irreverently as you want, whatever is your choice. So if you were Pope for a day, what would that day look like? What would be on your agenda?
I think what I would do, and I'm not sure this would be doable within a day. I don't want to overestimate what's possible in the day, but I would bring into being some kind of a huge musical event for the world. And this is not something that you see popes doing that regularly. The whole question seems to be couched in the idea of there being power and influence that I somehow want, which I'm not sure I actually do. But if I had it, I think what it would be a huge, diverse musical event that would somehow circle the globe and be a powerful symbol of the faith in that form for the entire world.
Well, there you go. There is another completely unique answer to that question that we ask all of our guests. I've never had anybody give an answer quite like that. So thank you. That really adds to our repertoire of what could happen on this mythical day. And speaking of kind of mythical questions, if you could meet or bring back to life a theologian or a historical Christian figure, who would it be? Who would you want to sit down and, have a meal with?
Yeah, well, if some listeners will have, when I mentioned the name of my grandfather, wondered if I was referring, your ears might have pricked up a little bit when I said the name Charles Haddon Spurgeon Dawes. Because my grandfather, who was a United Church minister, was named for the famous 19th century Baptist preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon.
Oh, okay.
And Spurgeon, the earlier, is a distant ancestor of mine. But that is not the only reason why he would be the one I would actually choose if I could bring one back to life and actually get a chance to meet. Spurgeon was known sometimes as the Prince of Preachers. He was apparently incredible to go to hear and listen. Many of his sermons are in print, and they come across as incredibly dry. So that makes it all his reputation even more impressive to me. But I'm guessing I wouldn't likely see eye to eye with Spurgeon on a lot of theological matters. But I consider him the prince of inspirational quotes. He's usually credited as the one who came up with the word thanks living. If you know that term, the idea of living a life of thanksgiving. And thanks living, it doesn't sound like some kind of a term that would be made up in the 19th century, but
No, it does not.
he's sort of the earliest instance that is actually recorded as a real quote. I just want to throw a couple of others. Famously, he said a very prescient one for our time: "A lie can travel halfway around the earth while truth is putting on its shoes." That's a pretty present quote for our time.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
there are a couple more profound. Giving is through having is one that I particularly love as well. He also said, "Fill the earth with your songs of gratitude." And germane to our topic, he said, "Anxiety does not empty tomorrow of its sorrows, but it empties today of its strength."
Hmm. Well, he does certainly have a way with a turn of phrase, doesn't he?
He certainly does.
Yeah.
I wonder what he'd
Okay.
say. He'd probably be incredibly incensed about the way the world is today. But I would like to bring him back.
Okay. All right. I think that's a really good answer. What will history remember from our current time and place?
Yeah, so I think we're at an interesting place, because you and I grew up at a time when the earth had been going from strength to strength, curing diseases, relieving poverty, acknowledging human rights, all sorts of really great stuff. This was sort of the regular order of business through my childhood and through our adolescence and so forth. And we lived pretty peacefully for quite a while in that time. And I think despite, and this is sort of for the church as well, you and I would always have had to look back for a worse time. And I mean, there were good times, if you look at numbers and that sort of thing, but there have been very bad times in history as well. So now this promise, when we sort of thought the world would just improve consistently forever, that hasn't entirely panned out in our current day. And so this is a time when I think we have to be very suspicious about our nostalgia, because we're beginning to lose things about the world we grew up in that we thought we could rely on. I think history will remember this as a time that we fractured our society out of self-interest, local self-interest. I think certainly our countries are doing this, possibly destroying ourselves in the process. We hope not, but and history will interrogate our response to that change, whenever we right the ship and begin to think like a world community again. I think that will happen, but
Yeah.
but I do think that's what history is going to say about this moment.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And that call to be suspicious of our nostalgia is very apt. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Well, yeah. So I think this time can certainly make us be wary about the problems of nostalgia. If I were to coin a phrase, "make Christianity great again," that phrase would be pretty politically, there's a political version of that phrase, which is very loaded and out there now. But to say it really seems to clearly divide the world into winners and losers. And that is really not the gospel, and it's not the Great Commission. It's, and make Christianity great again also, unfortunately, seems far too easily to abandon the gospel, and a gospel of love that we're really called to follow. And so we're replacing it with something that's a bit more aggressive and self-interested. So I think what I hope is that we can be careful as we look into the future of the church, that we can be truly connected to where we started. If I have a musical hope, I am kind of a content traditionalist. I'm very genre open. I love leading and playing worship music as much as and global music as much as I love traditional hymnody and choir and organ and so forth. But I'm content traditionalist in that we give our music a very important responsibility when it carries the word of God, when it actually is a conduit for the faith. We know it occupies a huge role in the human memory and the way we receive information and the way we retain it. I think our music, we have to be very judgmental about it. We have to be very sure that it contains the message that we want the church to be saying. And I think I think there's a lot of power that it has left to exert in the church. It very much matters. If I can go back to our SICM theme for this year, and as long as we can go into the challenges ahead, understanding that every decision we make about it really does matter.
Yeah. Church music matters. Where can people find out more about you, Chris? And if you want to plug SICM one more time.
Absolutely. Well, so Canada's Summer Institute of Church Music is online at sicm.ca. Our 2024 session runs from July 9th to 11, 4 hours a day, in person in Whitby, Ontario, and that's 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time in Quebec and Ontario, and then adjusted for time zones, obviously, across the continent. Again, a great welcome to our American friends if they are interested in joining us, either in person or online. We've been blessed deeply by those relationships in the past. People can find out information about me at ideasaboutmusic.ca. This is just a website where I've been collecting up little bits of my work from over the years, and it will, it's a little neglected from time to time, but you'll certainly find out a lot about me and things that I'm interested in, things that I'm passionate about. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you for such a thoughtful and insightful and unique conversation. I feel like a lot of what you offered today, we just haven't heard that voice on our podcast. So I'm really grateful to you, Chris. And we always leave with a word of peace. So, Chris, may the peace of Christ be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.